Welcome back to Strange Resort, the podcast that lurks in the shadows of otherwise sunny vacation destinations. I'm your host, George Hatfield, and today's episode is very unusual because I am being given access to a hotel room before its grand opening. I can't say the name of the hotel, but I can tell you that this building that I'm in is actually quite old. Right now I am standing in the hallway, looking at these eclectic oil paintings decorating the walls, and pondering how this opulent place could have once been known as the Harold Davis High School. Most of these rooms that once held disgruntled teenagers are now furnished with luxurious beds and 70s chic drapery. In just a few weeks, this new hotel will be filled with guests. Young newlyweds on their honeymoon, rowdy businessmen and women carousing between convention meetings, and perhaps the occasional ghost hunter seeking that one genuine haunting that will finally make him a true believer. So here's the deal. I know the electrician who has been rewiring the building, and he told me there is a room here that I must see. Classroom number 33. Right now we are standing outside the door of room 33. It is locked, but my friend has a key.
Don't tell anybody I let you in here, at least not till after the grand opening. That's when my contract's up, and then I don't care who you tell.
The room is empty. The walls are bare, the hardwood floors groan and squeak as my friend guides me to the center of the room to a small rug. The electrician lifts it up and reveals a pentagram encircled, surrounded by small cryptic runes written in a dusty, faded white. My electrician friend tells me that this has been here for decades, and I assume that he is pulling my leg. I touch the pentagram with my fingers and easily wipe away one of its points. It's just chalk.
I know that.
My electrician friend has brought along a broom. He sweeps the pentagram away. Only a smear of chalk dust remains, and he tells me that tomorrow the pentagram will be back. This isn't just the story of a mysterious bit of graffiti. It's the story about a school that lost 6 students in 1 year, and a teacher who may have been responsible for their demise. My first assumption about the pentagram is that it is a running gag, a practical joke, that either my electrician friend or some construction worker in the building has been drawing this pentagram day after day in secret to scare and fool his friends. But the electrician insists that it's something else. He explains that his great-uncle was a janitor back in the 60s all the way to the 1980s, and that the pentagram has apparently been on the floor every morning of every day since the mid-1970s. Is your uncle alive?
Yep, he just lives outside of town.
All right, I'm going to get to the bottom of this.
Good luck.
It's about 3 hours later. I got a little bit lost, and it didn't help that the electrician got the numbers of his address reversed, which makes me a little worried about his wiring capabilities. But eventually, I find the retired janitor. He is 91 years old, and though he is friendly and willing to talk, he doesn't want his voice recorded or his picture taken. but he did let me take photos of his lawn ornaments. He tells me that the chalk pentagram first appeared the day Mr. James Norman called in sick and never came back. That was back in March of 1974. Jim Norman was nearing the finish of his first year as an English teacher at Harold Davis High School. Before the semester's end, tragedy would strike several times over, and Mr. Norman would disappear before the police had a chance to question him. I asked the old janitor why Mr. Norman called in sick that day. He explained that Mr. Norman had been given time off because of his wife's recent demise, but also Mr. Norman had checked himself into the local hospital. There had been some sort of injury. Principal Fenton wouldn't say much to the janitor, but hinted that Mr. Norman would not be back for quite some time. That day at school, during the lunch break, the substitute teacher in charge of Mr. Norman's class reported graffiti on the floor of the classroom. The pentagram. The janitor claims that he cleaned up the floor with a damp rag, leaving no trace of this devil-worshipping symbol. But the next morning, the chalk lines reappeared. Just like me, the janitor assumed that this was some sort of an ongoing prank. After the last school bell rang, the janitor was alone in room 33. This time, he brought his mop. He moved all the desks to give the floor a good scrubbing, and that's when he found something in the center of the pentagram. At first, it looked like two burnt sticks, several inches in length. But they weren't sticks. They were charred fingers, index fingers, one from the left hand, one from the right, burnt down to the bone. He notified the principal, who just stared at them for a moment and said, "I'll see that he gets these." What I gather from this is that the new English teacher had cut off his fingers as if making a sacrifice. This idea of a satanic worshipping English teacher intrigues me, but I do find it a bit hard to believe. Still, I'm very curious about the history of Room 33, so I did some digging in hopes of getting back to the beginning. I quickly learned that Harold Davis High School was built during the Great Depression as part of the Works Progress Administration. By all accounts, the high school seems like a run-of-the-mill average institution, and Mr. Jim Norman seems like an average, albeit untested, English teacher, at least at first glance. Mr. Norman was born and raised in Stratford, Connecticut. He lived with his single mother and older brother. When Jim was 9 years old, he and his brother Wayne were walking to the Stratford Library to return an overdue book and pay the late fee of 4 cents. As they approached the railroad overpass, they were attacked by 4 teenagers. These hoodlums demanded money from the children, and when Jim offered them a mere 4 pennies from his pocket, the hoodlums began to beat them. Wayne, 4 years older than his kid brother, stepped up to defend Jim as best he could. He told Jimmy to run, and Jimmy did. According to the boy's testimony to the police, he looked back over his shoulder and he watched in dread as the teenagers stabbed Wayne Norman multiple times. The 12-year-old boy died from his injuries. I found all of this out from the records department, in the archives of the Stratford Police Department, as well as the Bridgeport Police Station. Just one day after the murder, the police brought in 4 suspects for a lineup. Young Jim Norman, traumatized, grief-stricken, pointed out 4 individuals. Pay attention to these faces. Vincent Corey, also known as Vinny the Viper. David Garcia, very recognizable due to his jittery eyelid. Robert Lawson, also easily identifiable, but this time by a strawberry birthmark on his chin. and Charles Sponder, aka Bleach, apparently a nickname for his failed attempt to become a blonde. Each individual was picked out of the lineup, but Vincent Corey's mother provided an alibi and no charges were filed. The murder of Wayne Norman remains unsolved. Years passed and Jim Norman grew up always under the shadow of his brother. Before Wayne's death, the 12-year-old had dreamed of becoming a teacher, so Mrs. Norman pushed that dream on her one remaining son, and 10 years later, Jim began to fulfill that vicarious wish by enrolling in Boston University. I wanted to find out more about Mr. Norman's career as a teacher, which seemed unlikely because, well, we're talking about 50 years ago. But my electrician friend had another surprise for me, a storage shed filled with decades of records of Davis High School.
These are all due to be shredded in about 3 or 4 days.
So I've got my work cut out for me.
Indeed you do.
And with a little bit of elbow grease, I found the Jim Norman file. After earning his bachelor's at Boston University, Mr. Norman interned as an instructor at Center Street Vocational Trades High. He was supposed to teach an entire year, but 2 things happened. First, his fiancée was the victim of a hit-and-run accident. Mr. Norman believed that teenage drivers were responsible, and no one was ever arrested for that crime either. His fiancée, fortunately, recovered quickly, but did suffer from a limp afterwards. Second, there was an altercation in Mr. Norman's classroom. He was trying to break up a fight, and one of his students punched him in the face. After that incident, Mr. Norman transferred to a different school to complete the year. But according to the notes, the event was deeply troubling, and Mr. Norman went to therapy for a number of months. The rest of the notes, scribbled down by a Mr. Simmons, the head of the English department, are very positive, and Jim Norman was officially hired several days after the interview. Also in Mr. Norman's files, there are records of grades that he issued at the end of the first quarter. Mr. Norman taught 5 classes, and I noticed that his first 4 periods were crowded with A and B students. But his 7th period class, that was a different story. The course was called Living with Literature, and there were lots of C's and D's and more than a few F students in the gradebook. My guess is that this was an English course for students who hated English. There's not much else of note here until winter break. That was when a car struck Billy Stearns, one of Mr. Norman's students. The young man had been out Christmas shopping. It was yet another unsolved hit and run. Witnesses say the vehicle was an old Ford sedan with the words "Snake Eyes" crudely painted on the side. After winter break, when Mr. Norman returned to class, a transfer student is added to the roster. This student is from a school called Milford High. A few weeks pass, and another 7th period student dies. This time, it's a young woman named Catherine Slavin. She was pushed from the rooftop of her apartment building, and like so many other crimes mentioned in today's podcast, this murder remains unsolved as well. But witnesses say they spotted several teenage boys racing down a fire escape, laughing. At school, the late Catherine's spot is taken by a second transfer student, also from Milford High. By the end of the month, another one of Mr. Norman's students goes missing. This person's name is Chip Osway, and he is perhaps not murdered, but he does disappear. The police report on this incident states that the young man may have left home in the middle of the night, perhaps to get away from his stepfather. Still, the missing student leaves another empty seat in Mr. Norman's English class. And again, that seat is filled by a transfer student from Milford High. So far, I admit, this seems mundane, a bit tragic, of course, but not out of the ordinary, until one looks at the photographs of the 3 transfer students. Now compare them to the teens that were brought into the lineup for the murder of Wayne Norman almost 20 years earlier. Even more bizarre, they have the same names. The first thought that comes to my mind is that this must be a mistake, or some type of joke, or some type of trick photography, or maybe these 3 boys with the same 3 names are simply the sons of the original delinquent trio. So I did a quick Google search to find out if I could contact Vincent, David, or Robert, and I discovered that approximately 6 months after the death of Wayne Norman, Officer Frank Simon was in pursuit of a speeding vehicle. That chase resulted in the electrifying crash of a black 1954 Ford sedan with Snake Eyes written on the side. There were 3 people in that vehicle that slammed into the main power line pole. All of them died. Their names, as you may have guessed, were Vincent, David, and Robert. I'm still trying to wrap my brain around all of this, so just imagine what it must have been like for Mr. Norman. Did he believe that evil spirits of his past had returned and were now in his classroom giving him a hard time? It's an intriguing idea, but how many ghosts have physical transfer records? I'm holding them in my hand right now. And this made me want to dig some more and find out about the Vincent of 1974, the one who transferred supposedly from Milford High School. Now, there are several Milford Highs, and the most likely candidate seems to be the one in New Hampshire, established in 1896. However, I could find no records of a Vincent Corey. But I also searched for the name Milford connected to any institution in the Stratford, Connecticut area, Mr. Norman's hometown. And the only Milford to come up on the Google search was the Milford Cemetery, the place where all 3 boys are buried. Spooky, right? It gets even spookier. Not long after the arrival of the Milford transfer students, Sally Norman, Jim's young wife, was murdered in yet another hit-and-run incident. Witnesses testified that the black Ford sedan had Snake Eyes written on the side. The day after the funeral, Mr. Norman checked himself into the hospital, presumably to receive treatment for his injured hands. After he leaves, no one ever sees him again. But I think something happened in between. I think, in the dead of night, Mr. Norman returned to room 33 one final time to perform a demonic ritual in order to achieve vengeance. A week after Mr. Norman's disappearance, Principal Fenton filed a missing persons report. When the police entered his house, there was no indication that James Norman had planned to leave for an extended trip. All of his things were there, including an overdue library book called Raising Demons by Johann Weyer. The author was a Dutch physician from the 1500s who argued against the burning of men and women accused of witchcraft. He believed that humans could not perform black magic, only devils and demons. He also contended that those evil spirits could create illusions, evil spells that would confuse hapless humans into committing terrible deeds, such as burning one another at the stake. My theory is that Mr. Norman drew the original chalk pentagram in his classroom, hoping to banish the undead bullies back to their grave, and perhaps, in some ways, it worked, because after the funeral, Vincent and David and Robert are never seen again. In a chapter titled Malefic Spirits and How to Call Them, Johann Weyer provides instructions about summoning a dark presence that will do one's bidding. Depending upon the request, the summoner may be required to shed the blood of an animal or to offer a piece of their own flesh, such as an ear or a finger or two. But I'm not convinced that demonic bullies were torturing Mr. Norman. Someone was torturing him, that is for sure. But there are too many logical possibilities, too many loose ends and suspects that haven't been considered. For example, Mrs. Corey, Vincent's mother. Maybe she blamed the Norman family for accusing her son and the subsequent car crash that took his life. Maybe it was Bleach, the fourth gang member who did not die. That admittedly seems a little unlikely since he's now a retired military man with a distinguished career. Or what about the missing Chip Osway? He was never found, and Mr. Norman gave him an F for cheating on an exam. But all of these feel like flimsy theories, and they ignore the one thing that started this journey, the chalk pentagram. The symbol that supposedly raised a vengeful demon. The image that continues to return no matter how many times it is erased. I need to debunk the claim that this is a supernatural phenomenon, or else I need to consider the possibility that something otherworldly is happening here. So what's going to happen with room 33? Will it become a hotel suite just like the others?
I have no idea what their plans are, but all I know is that they are not furnishing it, and I don't think they plan to have guests in it. So my guess they're just going to leave it as is and keep the door locked.
I don't suppose there's a possibility that I can stay in this room tonight?
Oh man, you're crazy.
Crazy or not, I have received permission. I will be staying the night, standing vigil in room 33, starting right now. All right. The door is shut. The floor is clean. I've taken a photograph showing nothing but a blank spot where a pentagram was earlier today. And I've got a lot of iced coffee to keep me wide awake. And I've got a bucket to pee in. You probably didn't want to know that. But that will ensure that I do not leave this room until morning, which is, about 9 hours away. So, to pass the time, I will be editing this podcast that I'm working on right now. And I will let you know if I hear anything throughout the night. It is 11:45 p.m. It's been almost 2 hours, and I am realizing that I should have brought some snacks with me. That is all I have to report. The floor is still clean. Okay, thanks. Have a good night. That was the security guard. He does know that I'm here. He's stationed a ways away, just checking on me. And it is what? It is 12:28. No pentagram. And now that I think about it, I wonder if that security guard that I just met, if he has been the one drawing a chalk pentagram night after night. And I think, unfortunately, I'm going to break down and use a bucket. It's 2:15 a.m. I'm not sure why I'm whispering, but the lights just went out. Like someone switched off a breaker. But fortunately, I've come prepared. I do have a flashlight, new batteries, and okay. The floor is still blank, still clear, no pentagrams. I thought for a second that I saw a star on the ground, but I think my eyes were playing tricks on me. I was going to freak out, but no, it's all clear. I guess back to waiting for the dawn. It's 3:35 a.m. I'm looking out the window. There's a strong breeze out there. It's a beautiful night. But the branches out there, the swaying, they keep throwing these shadows, and sometimes it looks like there are kids running between the trees. I really need to get my eyes checked after this. Did I make you yawn? It is 4:27. There are hints of dawn on the horizon, and still no marks on the floor. And I am almost done editing this podcast. And I've been thinking of adding some sort of cheesy ghost pun, as I like to do for the end of some of my episodes. So let's see what the internet has to offer. How about this one? What room does a ghost never enter? The living room. Or, this one's really bad. Who did the ghost take to the prom? His ghoul friend. Then there's the old classic. Knock knock. Who's there? Create custodia. Create custodia. Create custodia. Circulum terhare. Circulum terhare. Circulum terhare. Demonium stellum creare. Demonium stellum creare. Dissera verba. Dissera verba. Revertimer. 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 Boo! Boo-hoo! Don't cry, it's only a knock-knock joke. Now, I don't know if that one counts as a ghost. Oh, Jesus Christ. Oh. There's a pentagram on the floor. It's right there. And, oh, Jesus Christ. There's a piece of chalk in my hand. Thank you for watching and listening to the Stephen King Book Club. If you enjoyed this exploration of these fictional characters, then be sure to read Stephen King's short story, Sometimes They Come Back, featured in his collection called Night Shift.